Hello everyone! Today I would like to talk about my recently restored Kyosho Mega Force from 2001. I have acquired this model through eBay from Germany. It was quite in a dirty condition, but overall it was not very worn. This model has a 0.15 or 2.5 cubic centimeters engine. It's Kyosho GS15R engine. This is an interesting monster truck because it's 1/10 scale. It uses quite a small 1/10 scale body, but it has big wheels, and wheel sizes is like on the 8 scale monster truck. This model was unique because of several features. First of all, it had a QRC or quick reverse clutch gearbox. This gearbox has a reverse. The model originally was intended to be used with 2-channel radio. There was no this third servo you see here. It's my modification. And the model used 2 channels, meaning it will go forward, and if you slam it to the opposite side, it will go backward. In stock form, model does not have any brakes. It's only forward or reverse. And the throttle opening and the gearbox linkage movement is controlled only by 1 channel and 1 servo. This has an interesting feature because when you slam it to reverse, there is no remeshing of gears. There is a small pin inside which comes out of one gear and comes into another gear, and during that process there is a nasty sound like clack when you change the direction. But even the Kyosho states in the manual that you will not damage the transmission by doing so. Of course, I do not recommend going full speed forward and then slamming to reverse. I suggest that you release the throttle, come to the rolling stop, and only then use reverse. But in this case, the model does not have brakes. According to the manual, brakes can be added. I will talk about the brakes later. But with the expense of the reverse, you lose the reverse. Another interesting feature of this model, it has an electric starter. It doesn't have any pull start. You don't need to use glow plug heaters on here. You only need to use a battery like this, and you put a special adapter on the battery, and this is a plug where you plug in and it will start the model. What this does is it takes full battery voltage, 7.2 volts, and it takes that electricity to the small electric motor. It's like 380 size, and in the rear there is a small gearbox and one-way bearing. When the motor turns, it turns the engine. When the engine starts, on that one-way bearing, the engine will slip and the motor will disengage. And in order to get rid of this, there is a lead coming to the glow plug. It's a positive lead. The negative lead is grounded on the chassis. which is metal and has full contact with a glow plug. And since you cannot give full battery voltage to the glow plug, in this part there is a big resistor, ceramic resistor. So if we have fuel and we prime the engine, you simply do this. And it starts. Okay, this model was released in year 2001. Around that time, Kyosho released several other Nitro models. There was a Kyosho Mega Force Junior, which had the same body, just with the different stickers, but it was used on a different chassis. This one is big, stout chassis, and the Junior, released in the year 2002, was used on a different Kyosho chassis. The chassis was called QRC, also sporting the same reverse transmission, but it was a much smaller model, smaller wheels, smaller GS11X engine, and the transmission working on the same principle. It was in this case open, and it's not even oiled with grease. Here you can see the original QRC linkage system, where you have only one servo which controls the carburetor opening as well as the transmission linkage. You can see it goes one way, it shifts to the forward gear, and here it opens the throttle. On neutral, this sits in the center, there is no engagement with the teeth. This one is also idling. On a reverse side, this engages the reverse gear. Reverse gear is, instead of one gear, there are two gears, so they change direction. And this round arm still operates in the same direction and still opens the carburetor. You have to play and adjust the linkage, so you have some dead zone in the center. Also, you have less opening on the throttle on the reverse, so you don't get very fast, and you have more opening in the forward, so you have full speed. So this smaller Kyosho, my model is called Snakebite. It's modeled after a real Snakebite monster truck, but on this chassis there were several models, and one of them was Megaforce Junior. Kyosho likes to use similar names like Mad, Mega, Force, Crusher, and they mix these names to get different models. So, if talking about the same period, in 2002 there was released another monster truck. It was called also Force, but instead of Mega, it was Mad Force. This was a true 1/8 scale monster truck with a GX21 engine. It's a bigger 3.5 cc engine. And this model has absolutely different chassis. It's like a real monster truck. It has solid axles in front and the rear, and it has twin vertical plate chassis. Also, it has a chain drive and 3-speed transmission. So, I think it's enough of Kyosho history during the early 2000s. Let's get back to the Megaforce. When I received the model, it was very dirty and the engine was fully seized. The engine was not rusted. It was seized mostly because of dried up and gummed up castor oil. So I cleaned up the engine. I have disassembled the engine. and put parts in the nitro fuel, left there for some time to get soaked. Also, I used the ultrasonic cleaner. For external parts I used simply water, and for internal parts I put them in the bag, then I put some nitro fuel and throw it in the same water, so that ultrasound waves go through the water, through the bag, and through the nitro fuel. So after cleaning in hot water and hot nitro fuel, these parts were also brushed with a toothbrush, and they came out quite clean. What I did, I made new seals. I like to make seals from a seals paper. It's a gasket paper. You can cut whatever you want. You don't have to look for the parts online, especially for vintage parts. So I made a few seals like this one, where the exhaust manifold joins with this shoulder. There was no seal. There is only O-ring inside, which was worn and a little bit too small. It wasn't compressed well. So I put a small ring cut out from the gasket paper. For cutting rings, I use this Alpha circle cutter. It's very handy to make perfect circles from the gasket paper. So I also changed the hoses, cleaned up the fuel tank. I have disassembled all the parts and cleaned them in ultrasonic cleaner. Let's see the underneath of the car. The chassis has a very interesting design. It uses aluminum plate and also these plastic rails, which combined with the front and rear gearboxes and bulkheads make a solid structure. You can see dog bones going from the center QRC reverse transmission to the front and the rear. Model has full differentials. As you can see, the suspension is very plush. What I like when restoring models, I like to make suspension very smooth. I like to free up the suspension as much as I can. When I disassemble the model and take off the shocks, I check the arms if they are binding. There was some binding in the lower arms because they are made slightly too big, of course for tolerances, but they bind up. So I had to file down around a few places so the arms become free. Then I put more and more parts, like knuckles, like these turnbuckles, like upper arms, and every time I put something, I check if I still have a free movement, and if I see some hindered motion, I investigate and try to free it up. For example, Kyosho likes to use these ball ends, and they are slightly too large for the ball eyelets. So I take my Dremel, put on the ball, and sand it lightly with a sandpaper, so it gets a little bit, a fraction smaller in diameter, and it frees up. So after I have freed up all my suspension, I also rebuilt the shocks, cleaned them up, and also polished the shafts. I polished the shafts with several grades of sandpaper, and then with a polishing paste filled it with new oil. One moment. The shocks were binding within the pistons, and it was a severe binding because the piston was grinding on the wall, on the inside wall of the shock body. Because piston plastic is quite soft, I had to replace the pistons, but because I have a lot of Tamiyas, I have a bag full of Tamiya CVA pistons, and they fitted perfectly. Their diameter was just right, and they were no binding. They were very smooth. So overall, I got very smooth suspension movement. One mistake I did when I used ultrasonic cleaner with hot water with some degreaser, I put the springs, and suddenly where the spring paint was scratched, the water got underneath and lifted the paint. After that, springs were ugly, so I decided to remove all the remaining paints. So this was for one part when I was cleaning 4 springs. For another 4 springs, I didn't do that. I cleaned them manually, but since I had 2 sets of different springs, I simply put them symmetrical. One modification I made, I put on the 3rd servo so I can shift the reverse and forward and have also neutral on the 3rd channel. Now this setup is similar like on Traxxas T-Max. In stock form you can choose either reverse or brake. This model came with the chrome bumpers and the chrome was worn off, so I repainted them with silver to have a nicer look. So that's all about this model. This is quite a rare model. It's not very old, but it's not very common. It's difficult to get this model. It's very unique. I think it's interesting looking. Its body reminds me of early 2000 cars, where the forms and shapes were rounded and bubbly. This is a heavy model and it has a very small engine compared to its size. This model is imagined like a Traxxas T-Max, but it uses an engine like a 2-wheel drive 110 scale stadium truck. So this model is slow. It's more for scale running and not for crazy speeds. Of course, you wouldn't run this model at crazy speeds because it's of over 20 years old and it's very rare. But it's very nice seeing this model run. Thank you for watching.